All right. Well, there might be a few more people joining us in a few minutes, but I want to thank everyone for coming. It's great to see you all here. Just a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today and how this event is going to go. The event, I think we're going to have a very interesting topic and one that I think isn't raised much in the mainstream media at all. They shy away from it, and that is the evidence that SSRI antidepressants can, in fact, induce homicidal actions, behaviors in people who never even considered such a thought before. And we're also going to be discussing some of the legal and ramifications of that evidence in the once we get into courtroom situations and all. So David Healy is going to present for about an hour and 10 minutes. I think most of you probably know Dr. Healy. He's an Irish psychiatrist. He has a long history of involvement with SSRIs, first as a researcher, second when he was, in essence, in some ways involved with pharmaceutical companies, developing these, his own research as a clinician. And then over the past, David, what is it? When did RX Risk get founded?
That was about 2011, Bob.
2011. So for the last 12 years, he's been running rxrisk.org, which gathers information from patients, from users about adverse effects, and it's become a database and it provides a wealth of knowledge about adverse effects that we just don't hear about much in the rest of the media. And what's so important is it's reports by people who've been on the medications. That's why it's such a valuable database. After David's presentation, we'll hear from two panelists. We're going to first hear from Christopher Lane. Christopher is a member of Northwestern Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities, and he's a regular writer on Psychology Today. He's the author of many books. The one that I think is most well-known by the public is Shyness, How Normal Behavior Became a Sickness, which was published in 2007. And that details some of the behind-the-scenes changes to the DSM and the creation of anxiety disorders. He's going to give a very short presentation on the issues raised by this theme we're going to be discussing today. And then we're going to hear from Jim Gottstein. I think Jim is well known to many people on this webinar. I'm going to brag about Jim here for a second. In addition to, he's been a real activist. He started a law project for psychiatric rights. He's been active in Mind Freedom, numerous activist organizations. He started a Soteria project in Alaska. He also has been a great defender of people being confronted with forced treatment orders. And he won a law case in the Alaska Supreme Court. It's the only place I really know where the Supreme Court of a state put limits on the use of forced treatment, and that was the result of Jim's incredible work. And did I mention that he's also the author of the Zyprexa papers, which discusses how Eli Lilly, the drug company, hid the fact that Zyprexa caused diabetes and other metabolic problems, and its illegal promotion of Zyprexa. And Jim paid a bit of a price for that battle he waged. So after that, it's just a few quick. Then they're gonna speak, and then we'll open it up for Q&A to the audience and your comments. So that's the quick housekeeping. I'm going to now turn it over to David Healy. Thank you again, all of you, for coming, and we're going to be here for about 2 hours. So it's going to be a very interesting 2 hours. Thank you, and David, over to you.
Right, Bob. Thank you very much for that. And this talk is going to be very like the one that I did 4 weeks ago. It's going to be based completely on the things that I've been hearing people on antidepressants say, and some of that's pretty startling. What we need is more of that, though, because there are real issues here, and we're only going to understand them when we get input from the people who are on the pills. The experts don't know anything about the things that you're going to be hearing about. And one other thing that's very important that we need the input from listeners for, or at least for me is very important, is the issue about homicide on antidepressants brings some of the problems of prescription-only medicines in general to the fore, the ambiguities, and in particular, it brings out the point that it's very difficult to get justice. And if you can't get justice, you're not getting good clinical care either. So when you hear the problem, when you hear it outlined, what we need is, I mean, what I need, what we all need, I think, is your input. I don't have an answer to the problems you're going to hear about, and it's going to need a lot of thinking from all of us to try and work out how we move these issues forward. Now, the first challenge we've got in this area is contained in this slide here, which represents the fact that when I got email on my computer in 1997, the first emails, among the first 10 emails was an email from the United States from a law firm asking me to be an expert witness in a Prozac and suicide and homicide case. Maybe I ought to have said no, but I said, hey, yes, that sounds interesting. I didn't pay too much heed to the fact that the law firm said they couldn't get any other credible witnesses in the United States. And that's a problem that's got worse. For any of you who end up in the kind of problems and pickles and things like that that you're going to hear about, the fact that we can't get expert witnesses to take your side is a big problem we all have. Now, let me take you to South Carolina and Chris Pitman, at the age of 12, whom you see there. Chris used to have problems with his father and often used to go to his grandparents instead. And after one argument with his father, he ran away from home. He got picked up by the police. He got brought to a mental health unit where they put him on an SSRI for no good reason at all. The unit called his grandparents, who came and picked him up. And Chris used to often go to school from his grandparents' house and used to go to church with them. And things had been actually fine doing this. This time around, however, on the SSRI, he began picking fights with the other kids on the school bus. And he began being awfully restless in church, kicking the pews and things like this, to the point where his grandparents said to him, look, if this keeps going on, we're going to have to send you back to your father. Now, later that night, Chris's testimony was that he heard a voice saying to him, shoot them. So he got his grandfather's gun and he shot both of the grandparents. And then he seems to have got in their Jeep and drove off, and a few miles away was picked up by the police, who said, what are you doing in this Jeep? And he said, well, I don't know. I'm not sure what's happened to my grandparents. So they took him back to the house, which was burnt to the ground. Chris ends up in jail, and he's there for 4 years before his case comes to trial. When the case came to trial, he was 6 foot tall, and he looked awfully different to what he had looked at the age of 12. The South Carolina press pitched the issues in terms of evil are chemically compelled. The jury decided evil, and this gave the judge, Judge Piper, a real problem, and it gives us a real problem too, which is what the judge said was, this is a case of involuntary intoxication. And it seems to turn the whole medical system on its side. If you can't rely on the medicines your doctor gives you, you might end up having to go to jail. And he does send Chris to jail for 30 years because you had a problem on the pill that you weren't told about and you didn't consent to. So the judge is there saying there's something wrong about all this, something legally wrong. And the judge is right. And this is the point we're going to end up on, that there is a problem here that has never been put right anywhere. No jury has ever let a person who has killed other people claim that they did it because they were under the influence of the pills that they were on. No jury has ever let a person like that walk free from court. Don Shell, whom you see here, with his wife Rita and daughter Deborah and granddaughter Alyssa, was put on Paxil and 48 hours later shot Rita, Deborah, Alyssa, and himself. Tim Tobin, whom you also see here, wasn't actually there, and he took a legal action against GSK, and a jury in Cheyenne, Wyoming, decided that GSK did it. But they didn't have to let a criminal, Don, walk free from court because he was also dead. Now, in exactly the same week that verdict came in, over in Sydney, Australia, David Hawkins did walk free from court. He had killed his wife, and the prosecution and the judge agreed with the defense lawyer that if David Hawkins hadn't been on Zoloft, he wouldn't have killed his wife. But they didn't let a jury have a view. The legal system can work out that, it really makes sense to figure that this man isn't guilty and can let him go. But a jury is us with a range of views, and we're not all going to see things the same way. And in particular, we're not going to see the same things the same way, because after these two verdicts, Pfizer and GSK and Lilly and things like that began creating prosecutors' manuals to help the prosecutor persuade the juries that are us not to let people go free. So in the Pitman case, the prosecutor had a prosecutor's manual. Now, the history of these issues goes back 300 or 400 years, where Lord Chief Justice Matthew Hale in the UK said, look, we know that if you're delirious, if you're frenzied, and for most people that meant insane, that if you commit a crime while you're delirious, you're not guilty. And that's true to this day. But Hale added in an extra little bit, which is if you're delirious because your physician has put you on some pill that's poisoned you, you're equally not guilty in that case also. And the thinking that Hale had is caught here. The guy over on the left is raving mad. He's frenzied, in Hill's word. And he's either going to die because of the illness he has or because of the poison he had. So you're not going to have to let a criminal walk free, or else he's going to recover completely, in which case it'll be obvious that the person who kills someone else isn't the same person as we now have on our hands. And that seemed to make sense to most people. 200 years ago, things changed when Philippe Pinel said, well, yes, but there's insanities in which people aren't raving mad. They seem to be awfully cool and calm, and they've got a delusional belief. And the courts actually decided then, well, yes, and you can be not guilty there too if the delusional belief you have is that you're trying to defend yourself from a person who's trying to kill you. So as would happen in normal life, if you thought somebody else was actually trying to kill you, you have a right to defend yourself, and you have if you're mad also. But this person isn't going to recover, so we're going to lock them up for the rest of their lives. So it really makes very little difference that they're declared not guilty. Now, to this day, there are conditions where you can get off. If you're holding a gun and a hornet comes near you and you try to brush the hornet away and the gun goes off and you kill someone, we figure you didn't intend to do it. This is an automatism. And these can be extended as when you actually walk in your sleep and maybe kill someone. It's, we figure that it's not you that's there intending to kill that person. People have tried to introduce a few other areas here, like if you're under hypnosis or you've got multiple personality, is this you that's doing it? And for the most part, we've figured we're not prepared to let people who are under hypnosis and things like that get off. There's an old joke that helps bring out the point, which is hotshot lawyer talking to a bunch of wealthy women after a meal says, look, I'm sure most of you here have thought about trying to kill your husband at one point or the other. If you do, come to me because I'll be able to get you off. You've just got to remember one thing. Don't reload. It's the reloading that shows intent that hints that the action's not automatic. Now, over on the left there, you've got this guy called Albert Tyrrell, who claimed to have actually walked in his sleep and killed a lady and seemed to be confused and things like that and got off. But most people think today he probably wouldn't have got off because he also burnt the house down. And for most people, that sounds like there was a degree of intent there. And this may have been part of the problem for Chris Pitman, because he also burnt the house down. And that may be the thing that led the jury to figure, well, isn't a thing that was totally out of his control. Okay, so the first of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, was a drug called Zelmed that came out in 1982. For 20 years before that, serotonin reuptake inhibiting drugs like imipramine had been recognized that they could cause people to commit suicide and homicide. We'd also recognized for 15 years or so that there was nothing wrong with the serotonin system in people who were depressed or had any nervous problem. Now, when you gave an SSRI, it was going to be rather like giving LSD. The drug could have good effects for some people, bad effects for others. And that was the thinking that Arvid Carlson had when he made the SSRIs, listening to people who were on serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the older ones. He said there's a serenic effect linked to an action on the serotonin system. Let's make a pure serotonin reuptake inhibitor. By that, I don't mean a clean one. All he meant was one that didn't act on the norepinephrine system. These drugs can be filthy. They can do tons of other things. But if they don't act on the norepinephrine system, you can call them an SSRI. And when he did this, he found, yes, that these drugs can produce a serenic effect in some, but also he recognized other people told him they became suicidal on these drugs. So, at this point in time in my career, around 1992 or so, I'd been working on the serotonin reuptake system. I had links to the pharmaceutical industry, and here I am chairing the launch of Zoloft in the UK. And I give a talk at the meeting saying, serotonin is more primitive than estrogen. If we've now got drugs which act on the serotonin system, we're going to see and hear, if we look and listen, we'll see and hear new things that we have never seen before. And we need to pay heed. Now, that was not the message Pfizer wanted people to hear. They wanted to hear the message that we know everything there's to know about Zoloft, and the only job for a doctor is to give it, and the only job for the patient is to take it. And this is all caught in this marvelous cartoon by Michael Leunig from 30 years ago. Part of the issue here was the SSRIs were not particularly effective antidepressants. So one of the jobs the marketing departments had was to convert cases of Ativan and Xanax over to Prozac and Zoloft. And that's what's going on here. And add in the idea that, what the SSRIs are really vitamin serotonin, which are just going to top up your serotonin and everything's going to be just fine. And there's no chance taking vitamins that things can go wrong. The key point in this slide is on the bottom right, which is the doctor is the consumer of these drugs, not any of you who are on these pills. He consumes by putting the pills in your mouth. And the key thing was that the industry knew or wanted to ensure that he had no adverse effects at all. They knew for 10 years before that there might be adverse effects that would come his way. People that he put on the drugs could become suicidal and homicidal. People like Tracy Johnson, whom you see here, a 19-year-old who, stopping the SNRI she'd been put on, went on to commit suicide. And she wasn't the only person. Healthy volunteers, as you're going to hear, became aggressive and hostile, and several of them went on to kill themselves. So industry knew long before these drugs came in the market that these kind of problems were going to come their way, were going to come your doctor's way, and their issue was trying to manage all this. Now, there's a problem linked into all this, which juries have to deal with, which began 400 years ago, when the human body was becoming a machine. The heart, where we thought the soul was, had just become a pump. So René Descartes relocated the soul up to the pineal gland, and he illustrated what's going on here by showing you putting a foot too close to the flame, and said an image of the flame runs up to the pineal gland, where the soul looks at it and says, you better remove your foot from that flame. And this wisdom for Descartes proved that I think, therefore I am. And by that he meant my soul does the thinking, and therefore my soul, is. The body is a machine that's going to disintegrate, but the soul, if it's thinking the right way during the period of time that it's in the body, will ultimately go to heaven. And if it's thinking the wrong way, it'll go to hell. We're in the good and evil business here, the heaven and hell business. Now, it took 200 years for us to realize Descartes was wrong, that the removal of your foot from a flame, which we now call a reflex, involves no reflection, no thought by the brain or the soul or anything like that, that it's all organized by the body, which isn't really a machine. It's a mysterious me that senses and feels things. And over the next 50 years or so, we began to realize that almost all our behaviors are automatic and unconscious. This opened the door to the idea that rather than I think, therefore I am, I feel, I sense, I have hunches, therefore I am. And the people who realized this first were William James and Carl Lange, who said, our senses are the things that tell us what's going on in the world around us and the world within us. And they feed messages up to the brain, and the brain, looking at all this, classically gets things wrong. Now, 10 years after this, Freud comes along and says, well, I know how to read the automatic and unconscious thoughts from the body. The rest of you may not know it, but I know what's going on. And he said he knew what was going on based on an idea which he called libido. Now, you and I have libido and we can feel it going up and down and know roughly where it is, but Freud had a completely different kind of libido which couldn't be measured, something that really only he understood. And based on this, he figured he knew more about what was going on in you and me than we knew. And based on this, Freud and the Freudians went into hospitals and told doctors why this person was really having a heart attack, and went into law courts and told the courts who was really guilty or not, and gave mental health input into all these things a really bad name. So it's a good idea that Freud has been replaced, you might think, except he's been replaced by a bunch of bio-Freudians. We had a psychobabble before, we've got a biobabble now. We've got a bunch of shrinks for whom serotonin is the same kind of thing as Freud's libido. It's got nothing to do with the serotonin in you and me, but based on this, these guys seem to think they know more about what's going on in us than any of us actually know ourselves. They're rather like the Freudians in the sense of getting mental health a very bad name with its input into the rest of medicine and to the legal system, but not because they march in and tell people what's actually going on. They don't march in at all. They just say, you have to believe what the companies tell you is going on. Now, when we introduced the first drugs for nervous problems during the 1950s, the benzodiazepines, the beta blockers and things like that, it was on James Lange thinking and not Freudian thinking. The idea was the drugs were going to fool the brain. And what you got was, if in the case of a beta blocker, it'll slow your heart rate, it'll stop you actually perspiring, it'll ease the shake in your hand, and my brain will look at me and figure, well, all these things aren't happening, so he can't be too anxious. But if my cardiologist had given me a beta blocker because my heart rate's too fast, he will know that he needs to tell me if he's going to stop the beta blocker, that my heart rate may increase in speed, and my brain may be fooled and think that I'm anxious when I'm not. The problem is going to ease off after maybe 48 to 72 hours. There's one more important thing here, which is 40 years ago or so, I'd give a beta blocker to a colleague. And the idea was we were going to check what happened to heart rates. And the most solid finding in all of medicine is beta blockers slow heart rates. After about 15 minutes, she became anxious. So we checked her heart rate and it had increased. which taught me, and I hope you, an important point, which is what's happening in real life is what's happening in front of you. What's in books is not real. It may be helpful, but it's not real. And part of the problem we've got at the moment is that doctors in general, and it's not just mental health, have become people of the book rather than people who are able to assess things in real life. When it comes to trying to assess just what's happening to the person in front of them, increasingly, if it conflicts with what the books, evidence-based medicine says these drugs do, doctors don't know how to handle it and can't help you out when you have a problem on these drugs. Now, here's a guy who used to be in real life, but I guess isn't these days. This is T-Rex. And if you look at his eyes there, there's very little space for a brain above his eyes. And that's because T-Rex gets by with a bird brain. If you look over on the right, you've got the human cortex, which is all the pink stuff there. T-Rex's brain is the top of the spinal cord going up with the blue dot in it and the green dot. The blue dot is where his norepinephrine is and where yours and mine is, and the green dot is where the serotonin is. Now, if you let me say that the top of the spinal cord is part of the body rather than part of the brain, then 100% of the serotonin in you and me is in our body and none in our brain. If you insist the top of the spinal cord is part of the brain, then 5% of the serotonin in you and me is in our brain and 95% in our body. SSRIs act on the body. They don't act on the brain. And we ran an experiment 25 years ago or so, which helped give us an answer to all this, which was we had a bunch of medical and nursing staff who agreed to take an SSRI or a non-SSRI for a period and then cross over to the other. And their challenge was, could they distinguish between the SSRI and the other antidepressant? Was Arvid Carlson right? SSRIs produce a serenic effect that other antidepressants don't produce. And the answer is, yes, they could, and yes, he was right. But the really interesting thing that happened here was within 24 to 48 hours, I had patients in the unit come up to me and ask me, is that doctor on a pill? And is it an SSRI? And the answer is he was, and it was an SSRI. How did you know that? And they were able to tell me that, look, based on the body language and how the person's facial expressions were and the lack of reaction to things, they knew he was on an SSRI. What we've got here is a situation that patients have expertise in being able to tell what drugs other patients and staff, in this case, are on that the staff don't have. So, the issue is, who are the real experts here? Who should be running the show? Now, what the patients could see and didn't need brain scans for, you can see here, which is on the left, you've got a bunch of healthy volunteers, and that's what the brain scans look like before they get one dose of an SSRI. On the right, you've got the brain after one dose of the SSRI, and the researchers in this said, hey, look, SSRIs turn the brain off. And the answer is, no, they don't. What they do is they turn the sensory system off, and if your senses are tuned down, the brain goes quiet, which is what you're seeing here. You can get exactly the same thing in a different way. When you take an SSRI, within half an hour, your genitals go numb, and the genital spot in the brain will go quiet. You can get exactly the same result rubbing lidocaine paste into the genital area. And last I heard, lidocaine paste doesn't get into the brain. And this effect, this sensory numbing, this numbing of your feelings, which people also call emotional numbing, is key to what these drugs do. It's what we're aiming at, provided it isn't in such a high dose. If we don't get too much of it. And I guess the point I needed to make earlier, and I will make now, which is everybody who got an SSRI, because they're weak antidepressants, everybody who got an SSRI got them in toxic doses until recently. 20 milligrams of Prozac is a toxic dose of Prozac. Sounds like a low dose to other people, but it's not. When you get the emotional numbing these pills can cause, even if it isn't over the top, you're going to get an experience that's a bit like the one outlined by Maxime Villeneuve here, which says, the best way to describe it is mental anesthesia. The psychedelics like LSD, which work on the serotonin system, open the mind up. You've got more vivid kind of sensory experiences. The SSRIs do just the opposite. They tune things down. They turn the mind off. Everything feels wiped out. And this comes into play here as well. This is Louis XVI of France getting guillotined. Some years ago, about 10 years ago, we had a load of Westerners being beheaded by ISIS over in the Gulf, and they recorded the beheadings. And one of the things you found, if you looked for it, was people on SSRIs were watching these video recordings. And if you asked them why, they said, well, it's because I can't feel when I'm on these drugs. I need to see something horrific like this in order to be able to feel something. So that's what emotional numbing can do. And this is one of the greatest documents in healthcare. I've told you that an SSRI within 30 minutes can numb your genitals, your orgasms mute, and over time, if you're on the drugs, your libido drops. And everybody expects, well, that's tough, but it'll be fine once I come off the drugs. And the thing is, it often isn't. The problem gets much worse when you come off the drugs and may remain bad for the rest of your life. And here's three guys who got what's called pssd, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. And their podcast really brings out how grim healthcare has got these days. And I've got two quotes here from Bryn. Bryn is saying, look, getting PSSD undermines your faith in medicine and science. And it's not just because you've got PSSD. It's as much because you go to a doctor and it's like you've had your arm chopped off and you go into the doctor and you say, look, I've had my arm chopped off. And the doctor looks at you and says, well, you look fine to me. You've got a problem that's pretty serious, as serious as having your arm chopped off. You try to explain it to the doctor who is not looking at you and not listening to you. They're unable to do so anymore. And that's what rocks your faith, or my faith at least, in medicine these days and in science. And Bryn also makes a point which applies to homicide as well, which is we have to remember that we're not going to be believed, because most people, when they hear that our drugs have caused PSSD, or if I say, look, well, my drug caused me to commit homicide, they'll say FDA wouldn't let a drug like that on the market. And that's what we're up against. This all comes into play here as well. Many of you listening in may be too young to remember Peter Kramer's book, Listening to Prozac, which turbocharged the SSRI group of drugs with his claim that Prozac could make you better than well. It's good psychotherapy in pill form. And as evidence for this, he said, look, I had a patient who was homosexual, and on Prozac, he became heterosexual. Now, this claim goes back 35 years before Kramer, when Peter Kramer was probably wearing diapers, to Roland Kuhn, who introduced the first serotonin reuptake inhibiting drug, imipramine, and he made exactly the same claim. And the point behind this isn't a cure the illness effect of these drugs. This is a change of personality effect of the drugs. What you've got to remember, I guess, is that God didn't give us these drugs to change our personality for the morally better. If they can change your personality, they can change it in all kinds of ways. Rather than get better than well, you may become worse than ill. But, you know, the better than well message gets halfway around the world before the worse than ill message has a chance to put its boots on. And the worse than ill message is in this marvelous book and movie. If you haven't seen it, it's a wonderful movie. In it, a female school teacher sexually molests her teenage male pupils. Now, there's been a lot of female teachers who've ended up in court because they've done just this and have been able to get off because they were able to persuade the court that when I stopped the SSRI, I mean, it all happened when I was on the SSRI. When I stopped the SSRI, the problem went away. Other courts have refused to let the argument into court at all, and school teachers have gone to jail. Pills aren't mentioned. Prozac isn't mentioned in the book or the movie, but I can tell you, Zoe Heller, when she wrote the book, was taking Prozac. What you're looking at here is a change of personality, and I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail, but just let me quickly mention first Jan Ackerblom's marvelous documentaries, Who Cares in Sweden? And he asked the question, which is, if SSRIs make you care less, are any of the contracts that we sign legally valid if we're on one of these drugs? What I've got here is the dove of peace throwing away the olive branch. And what I'm trying to bring out is it doesn't take a human cortex to have a change of personality. Our personalities are things that are shaped by our habitual reflex and automatic responses. And they're driven by sensory input. And if we're on drugs that numb the sensory input, it's going to show up as a change of personality that your friends and family, and if you're a doctor working on a ward with a bunch of patients, the patients are going to recognize before you do. It can be very obvious. Now, muting of our emotions doesn't sound like on its own the kind of thing that's going to cause people to commit homicide. But there's another thing that happens to our emotions, which is we can have a state of emotional turmoil, or as is normally called, akathisia. Akathisia came on our radar during the 1950s with a drug that works on the serotonin system called reserpine. It was an antihypertensive drug, so it was being given to people who were normal people, had no nervous problems at all. And on it, they reported being better than well. They reported that this is good psychotherapy in pill form. They used all of the language Peter Kramer used 35 years later. They also reported, some of them did. I mean, while there was a bunch who did awfully well, there was a bunch who then reported, who also reported, look, I became tense and restless and felt awfully uncomfortable. I had increased feelings of strangeness. I didn't feel like myself, and I became afraid of some of the unusual impulses I had. Now, one of the things everybody agrees is Rezepin can cause suicide and can cause homicide. And it's through akathisia that it does so. Now, this is David Foster Wallace trying to describe to people who don't know what it's like to have akathisia what the situation's like. And all of these kind of slides are going to be up on the risk.org post that will go with this. So you'll have all the slides there and you'll be able to read at the quotes. What he's saying is having akathisia is a bit like being in a burning building. And you've got the flames coming towards you. And, the issue is, do you want to jump out the window, even though that's going to kill you? But I guess you're thinking, which is going to be the least painful form of death? I was trying to explain akathisia to a prosecutor some months back, giving her this instance, and her response was, well, you still have a choice, don't you? And I guess the issue is, do you? Is there a choice in a situation like this where, you may end up killing someone else or not? How much of a choice do we have? Here's Bruce Springsteen saying very much the same thing. Again, this is a great description of Akathisia, which goes through 2 or 3 pages of his book. Uh, and this is just a bit of it where he's saying, look, I understood what drives people toward the abyss. There was no life here, just an endless, irritating, existential angst embedded in my bones. And I think Bruce is right. This is in your body, it's in your bones, it's not in your brain. And it was demanding answers that I did not have, which is, are you going to kill yourself or are you going to kill that other dude over there? 20 years ago, the SSRIs came off patent. Prozac got rebranded as Zarafem, and PMT or PMS got rebranded as PMDD, a horrific disorder that causes women to be aggressive and hostile, and SSRIs can sort this out. Now, the emotional muting that they cause can be helpful to some extent, perhaps. I'm not arguing, I don't have the background experience to say. But what I can tell you, the clinical trial data shows that the women taking an SSRI compared to women taking placebo were more likely to have aggressive and hostile events on the SSRI than on the placebo. And this is what you'd expect from a drug that causes akathisia if you're throwing it into a situation that has a degree of akathisia to begin with. Here's a further example of all this, which is, I told you that SSRIs can genitally numb you. They can also cause genital irritability. And this gives rise to a condition called persistent genital arousal disorder, where women have repeated orgasms, women in particular, but not just women, repeated orgasms that are terribly distressing, that can be triggered by the vibration of a car, distressing to the point where women have had clitoridectomies and other drastic procedures to try and control the whole thing. Now, one of the points that again, this is triggered by SSRIs. One of the points that I'm trying to make here is that this can coexist with pssd. It's not like when I gave a beta blocker to my colleague and their heart rate speeded up, and the book say it ought to slow down. Well, the one thing that can't happen is it can't both speed up and slow down. But in the case of emotional muting or emotional turmoil, or genital muting and genital turmoil, they can coexist. And when they do, the malignancy of each is hugely increased. You're going to have awful thoughts about drastic things to try and put the problem right, and you're going to be numb to the consequences. So again, when women have a clitoridectomy, how much choice is involved in that? Here's Anne-Marie Kelly, who's put on the map for all of us the fact that SSRIs can cause alcoholism. Now, if you ask the question, why would they cause alcoholism? One of the answers is for sure that alcohol is a good treatment for SSRI-induced akathisia. And this came into play to some extent, I think, in a legal case in the UK some years ago, where a lady who had fetal alcohol syndrome took a legal action to try and get support for the fact that on the basis that she'd been criminally injured by her mother drinking alcohol while she was pregnant. And the courts actually decided, weirdly, well, no, you can't get compensation or you can't get support because you were a fetus at the time, and a fetus is not a person. But the point I want to make is this, which is that one of the things that most women understand more than anything else is you don't drink during pregnancy. And most of them try and stop drinking completely. They certainly don't start drinking, and they don't start drinking compulsively when pregnant, unless they're taking an SSRI. The epidemiology of SSRIs during pregnancy compared with non-SSRI, being pregnant and not taking an SSRI, is there's a tenfold increased rate of fetal alcohol syndrome in the women taking SSRIs. This is not done by choice. From for me, this helps get over the idea that what you've got is compelled behavior. Which brings me on to a few bits of compelled behavior here. Let me begin with the book on the left, which is Katinka Newman's The Pill That Steals Lives, a marvelous book. Many years beforehand, unbeknownst to her at the time or even later, Katinka had a serotonin reuptake inhibiting antihistamine, which caused a really bad reaction. Many years later, when she had two children, she gets put on one again to help her kind of sleep because she's having poor sleep and has a very bad reaction to it. This time, her doctor switches her from the antihistamine to an SSRI, which is going to make things even worse, and she becomes delirious. She thinks she stabbed her children to death. She has cut her own wrists. She ends up being brought into hospital where she won't turn on the TV or the radio because she is sure the news is going to be reporting about this awful woman who's just killed her two children. As the drug wears out of her system, though, she gets hold of the fact that, I think this drug caused the problem. She tries to tell the treating team that her drugs caused the problem. They pay no heed to her. They tank her full of drugs, a huge amount of drugs. They destroy a year of her life till her insurance runs out and she gets chucked out of hospital and the drugs stop and she recovers. The situation for the man on the right, David Cresby, in this book that's going to be out next March, which is well worth reading, is he did kill his two children. And unfortunately, unlike Katinka, he ends up in the mesh of the legal system with prosecutors who have manuals and things like that. And he ends up in jail and he's there still. It's a very grim scenario. Now, let me tell you about a few other, let me outline a few other vignettes. Recently, I was talking to a lady who had been on an SSRI 30 odd years ago. And she hadn't been on it for long. And we were actually talking about a completely different problem when she mentioned that, when I was on this SSRI, I was at a party one evening and I wanted to get a drink and I brushed past a lady on the way over to the drinks. And as I did, I had this violent urge to harm her. And it was completely shocking. I have no idea where this urge came from. And, I had to work hard not to do anything. Now, 30 years later, having been off all these drugs for almost all that period of time, she still has these urges from time to time. She now recognizes that they're nothing to do with her. She now recognizes she needs to breathe deeply, doesn't understand what's happening, but knows that you just can't act on this. But they can be very distressing still. Let me switch to an older man who'd had a minor stroke. And the doctors treating him for the stroke figured he wasn't recovering as quickly as they'd like, so they put him on an SSRI. And then they asked me to come along and see him. So I came to see him and figured there's no need for this man to be on an SSRI. He's not depressed. So we halted the SSRI. And I figured I'd come back a few days later just to make sure that I didn't get things wrong. And he was awfully pleased to see me. And he said, hey, look, since you stopped those pills, the awful thoughts have gone away. And I said, what awful thoughts? And he said, well, look across the ward. You see that man in the bed on the far side? I don't know who he is. But while I was on those pills, I had this insane urge to get up in the middle of the night and go over and strangle him. And those thoughts have gone away since you halted the pills. I had a man recently get in touch who talked about, look, on an SSRI, I had horrific nightmares, both on them and coming off them. And we know SSRIs and SNRIs can cause terrible problems like this. They can give you a lucid dreaming type problem as well, which is you're not sure whether this was just a nightmare or whether, it was real life. It can be so vivid. In this man's case, the imagery of what was happening was so awful that he couldn't bring himself to tell me what was actually going on or what he was worried about. Let me tell you one more vignette, which is I had a lady some years ago. Now, I don't usually let husbands bring wives in to see me, but this man insisted that she wouldn't tell me the truth if he wasn't there. So he came in and I listened to her tell me that she'd been on the vaccine for a few days. And then she took off all her clothes and went out the front door of the house out onto a busy road. And I said, why did you do that? And she said, well, a voice told me to. This is what we call a command hallucination. And if you remember, Chris said he had a voice telling him to shoot the grandparents. We often call it the voice of God, but given that we don't know what God's voice looks like, it's really just a command hallucination, which for some reason people feel compelled to obey. I should tell you as well that if you're a wealthy woman who has this urge to kill your husband, you need to be careful if you've got nightmares about killing your husband, because what SSRIs can do is turn off the motor inhibition that we normally have when we dream, which means that we don't act out on our dreams. That can, that can be gone so that you do act out on your dreams. This is called rapid eye movement behavior disorder. So these are all bodily effects, nothing to do with the cortex of the brain. What role does the cortex of the brain play in all this? Well, it's the bit of us that companies program in order to get us to think and see things the way they want us to think about them and see them. And they do it in a few ways like this. One is, this is a man, well, this isn't actually a man, this is just an image of something that happened in a Pfizer trial where a man poured gasoline on himself because the drug he was on was making him feel akathisic and suicidal. He was trying to kill himself, so he set fire to the gasoline, didn't die there and then. He ended up being brought into hospital where he died from his burns 5 days later. In the trial and in the literature, if you look at this trial and what this drug does, he's coded as death by burns, not death by suicide. Now, when an event like this happens, hospital or death, there's supposed to be a narrative report to let FDA, but they often don't look at these things, or you or me, if we did get a chance to see them, just what actually happened. And when you read the report in this man's case, you know he should have been coded as death by suicide. But it's not there. And companies have learned how to shuck their legal obligations in this area. In Study 329, which was Paxil given to teenagers who were depressed, a young boy, 15-year-old, after being on Paxil for 2 weeks, ends up out in the street waving a gun around, threatening to kill people. So the police get called. They bring him to hospital, and there should be a narrative report. There isn't. FDA to this day, I'm sure, don't know what happened to him. Are the other 3 children taking Paxil in this trial? I do. But again, this is not something that gets reflected in the literature about these drugs. Here's the suicidal events that happened in the clinical trials done of these 3 SSRIs. The red dots are the suicidal behaviors. And you see there's much more on the SSRIs. You also see just under the word screening, there's a number of suicidal events that happen there, which happen when people are whipped off the antidepressant they've been on beforehand, which they need to come off before going into the clinical trial of the new drug. And this is a very dangerous period, among the most dangerous there is. For companies, though, it offered an opportunity. They looked at this and said, well, people in this washout phase are on nothing, which is the same as being on placebo, isn't it? So maybe we can hide the problem we've got with our drug by moving those red dots over into the placebo arm of the trials that were done. This breaches FDA regulations. It's wrong, utterly wrong. You might even call it fraud, but you can't, because as the companies have told us, FDA saw exactly what we did and didn't say anything. So here's Zoloft. Pfizer did 4 trials of Zoloft in PTSD. In all 4 trials, the results were negative for men. In 2 of the trials, they're marginally positive for women. Based on that, FDA were happy to license Zoloft for PTSD. And the company wrote up those 2 trials. One of them was going to go to the pharmaceutical industry's favorite journal, which is the New England Journal of Medicine. The other was going to go to JAMA. And over on the left, you see the words author TBD, to be determined. That is, the marketing department in Pfizer was going to pick out the names of people who would be good doctors to have on the authorship line for marketing purposes. None of these authors, and nor as the ghostwriters that wrote the articles, and all of these articles are ghostwritten, none of them are written by the people whose names are on the authorship line. None of these people get to see the data. FDA don't get to see the data. No one gets to see the data. The greatest concentration of fake news on earth centers on the drugs your doctor gives you, and it's not just mental health drugs. This is the most effective propaganda on earth. The best propaganda is invisible, and this is propaganda masquerading a science. It's a recovered memory syndrome, a recovered memory of a benefit that never happened. I told you study 329 was Paxil given to teenagers who were depressed. And in 2001, GSK wrote up the results of that, saying Paxil worked wonderfully well and was free of problems. A year later, they applied to FDA to get Paxil approved for teenagers who were depressed. And they told FDA, we did 3 trials in teenagers who were depressed, and they were all negative. The FDA, when they agreed to license Paxil for teenagers who were depressed, and you thought they didn't actually agree to this, they said, we agree with you, all 3 trials were negative. And we also agree with you that it wouldn't be a good idea to mention this in the label of the drug. Why not? Well, one of the consequences of mentioning it in the label might have been that some person, some sharp lawyer might have said, oh, well, there's an article out here claiming the drug worked wonderfully well, and the label says this trial didn't work. The drug was negative in this trial. That's fraud, and we could maybe sue GSK for fraud. And nobody would want that to happen. So how often does something like this happen? The white boxes there are the publications on the trials of the antidepressants we know and love in all the good journals saying these drugs work wonderfully well and are completely safe. But when FDA looked at the same trials, they had a slightly different view, which is they look like this. And what you need to know here is if you look at the adult trials and the pediatric trials, more than half the trials done on these antidepressants to get them on the market were negative. The other alarming thing is 1/3 of the previously positive trials you've just seen were in fact negative. The companies had either told FDA or FDA had worked it out that the trial was negative, but it's been published as positive. And this is much more dangerous than leaving negative trials unpublished. And what's going on here is this is a John the Baptist advert. It's preparing the way for the Celexa Messiah that's just about to come along. And doctors are being told that this drug will just focus in on the one thing that needs to happen, where the defect is, and it's going to zoom in and put that right. It's going to be a magic bullet. And if you look at the image in the middle there on the right, it's not going to affect any other bit of the body. And if you look at the guy down below, it's not going to interact with anything else that the person may be on. This is a magic bullet ad. Most drugs in medicine, almost all of them, are therapeutic principles. The man who introduced me to that word was Arvid Carlson. And he said, look, laxatives, there's 4 different kinds of them, and there's 4 different kinds of constipation. And your grandmother used to be good at picking out the right kind of laxative for you when you were a kid, and doctors used to be good too. But when a company gets a license to call their drug a laxative, they've got no incentive to make sure that you get the right one for you. Their incentive is to make sure everyone with constipation ends up on their drug, and they don't mind if you end up on the other kinds of laxatives also, but that's the recipe for treatment-resistant constipation. Now, when Carlson made the first SSRI, he said it's a serenic principle. It's going to suit some people, not others. It's just one of the many things that could be done to treat nervous problems. If it's not the right drug for you, it increases the risk of you ending up with treatment-resistant depression, for which euthanasia is increasingly the answer these days. Carlson, though, as I said, listened to people when he came up with the idea of an SSRI, and when they told him they could become suicidal on the drug. He listened to people with OCD who went on SSRIs, for whom these drugs can be very helpful. But a lot of them told him, look, your SSRI didn't suit me. When I took up smoking, that was a lot better. So he went and ran a trial of nicotine in OCD and said, yep, there's a bunch of people who are not going to respond to SSRIs, and nicotine will be a lot better for them. Now, if this is true for OCD, it's true for most of the anxiety states we have as well. And this is the point I'm making, which is that there are different therapeutic principles, and that's a narrative that hands control back to us. Because you're the only person that can decide if nicotine suits you better than an SSRI. What about safety? Well, the risks of cardiac problems are as great on SSRIs as on nicotine. The risks of diabetes and weight gain are much greater on SSRIs than nicotine. The risks of sexual dysfunction are much worse on SSRIs than nicotine. And the problem is, most of the people get put on SSRIs these days are being put on not just a toxic dose of a drug, but a drug that even to begin with at a lower dose probably couldn't have helped them at all. Nicotine would have done better. So that's how companies program us to think the way they want us to think. Let's leave them out of the frame for the moment and just ask, where does our cortex come into all this? And there's this great book on the left, which I'm sure loads of you read, called Thinking Fast and Slow, which in essence is giving you a version of the argument I've just given you, which is most of our thinking is hunches that come from the body, which are shaped by stereotypes and things like that. And for the most part, get answers to the problems we have right, because if our hunches didn't get these things right, we'd be extinct. But every so often we don't get things right, and that's where we have to think slowly instead. And the implication these days, the vague thinking probably is, this is what happens at the cortex of the brain. This is what the ghost does. You know, the ghost is the bit of us that becomes a scientist or a philosopher and thinks the right way, so ultimately we're going to go to heaven rather than hell. Well, that's all wrong. There's no bit of our brain that thinks that way that she makes us either a scientist or a philosopher or good. Science is about coming to a consensus between us. Good behavior is about being shaped by our parents and the society in which we live. There's no bit of the brain that guarantees these things. If you ask people where the ghost is, they'll tend to say these days, well, it must be the frontal lobe, the executive bit of the brain. What does executive mean? Well, it's over on the right there. When you walk into a bathroom, you'll often see a cord like this, and you pull it, and you end up in a dark bathroom. And you realize you've made a mistake, and you go back and pull the cord again. That's thinking slow. No matter how often you make the mistake, you're still at risk of making it each time you walk into a bathroom. And it's a bit like if you've got a frontal lobe lesion. If you've got a temporary frontal lobe lesion in the sense of being absent-minded. If you've got a frontal lobe lesion caused by a tumor, and there's a filthy, dirty hairbrush on the floor, you are likely to pick it up and brush your hair with it. That's because hairbrushes say, pick me up and brush my hair with it. Just the way the cord here says, pull me, and Alice in Wonderland was faced with bits of food which said, eat me, and bits of drink which said, drink me. So our cortex just inhibits certain reflexes, but it's not a thing that makes it scientific or decides between good and evil. And this man here had a frontal lobe tumor and became pedophilic and was charged, but ended up walking out of court free because it was recognized that he had a frontal lobe tumor. And when he was cut out, his behavior returned to normal. In the same way, SSRIs cause frontal lobe syndromes like this because our emotions are muted, but they can be removed, just like the tumor could. So the question is, why don't we take this into account? I want to quickly introduce you to one extraordinary syndrome, catatonia. Most of you will know, faced with a threat to your life, we can fight or flee or freeze. Catatonia is when you freeze. Now, if I was frozen and you came up to me and gesticulated, chances are I'd copy your gestures. I'd mirror image them or reverse mirror image them. But the point behind either of those is you're controlling my behavior. It's not under my intention. If you're frozen, you're obviously not going to kill people, but catatonia can come in hyperactive forms as well, where people are like a whirling dervish going around the place, pressing buttons they shouldn't press, hitting staff, injuring staff, and they can kill people. But again, there's no intention here. This is not a mental illness. This is a bodily disorder. It can be triggered by physical illnesses. It can be triggered by emotional shocks, even though it's a bodily disorder, and most commonly triggered by drugs, in particular the antipsychotic group of drugs. Now, what I think we're looking at with the SSRIs and some of the states I've outlined is I've coined a new word, and this is a bad idea when I talk, akathisia. You've heard anesthesia, where we turn the sensory system off. Akathisia is where we make the sensory system wonky. And it's like catatonia, where we've made your muscle tone wonky. This on the left is a man who had the most clear-cut SSRI-induced homicide I've ever seen. He had no mental health problems at all. He gets put on an SSRI for a minor concern. He used to keep a diary beforehand and kept it while he was on the pills, and you can see his changing mental state. He becomes agitated, worried that he's going insane, that he's going to be locked up in hospital. And this all happens awfully quickly. His wife sees him become agitated and gets people in who know him well to have a look at him, and they've never seen anyone as agitated, restless, pacing up and down, tearing his hair out as he is. They haven't fingered the pill, and no one expects what happens next, which is on the seventh day, he gets a mallet when he wakes up and batters his wife to a pulp. He ends up in hospital, the drugs are withdrawn, and he returns to normal. I write a report to him saying this man is not guilty. He should be let walk out of jail. His lawyers have a better idea. They say, let's go for a plea deal. You mightn't get off. The judge might not let you off. With a plea deal, she'll probably agree to a 1-year jail sentence, which she does. And that, I mean, you can see how a man like this might be talked into that. He ends up coming out of jail after a year to a town where everybody liked him and nobody thought he was a murderer when he went in to hospital. But he comes out a convicted murderer and no one will speak to him. He has to leave the town and leave the country. The gun on the right is James Holmes, the Aurora shooter, who goes on Zoloft, a shy, inhibited guy at university, keeps himself to himself, goes on Zoloft, has a change of personality, becomes disinhibited, begins to flirt with girls, begins to buy guns, and tells his doctor, you know, if you knew the thoughts that were going through my head, you'd lock me up. And she says to him, well, you're responsible for your thoughts. He shoots 12 people dead and injures 72 others. Now, I didn't think the drug was likely to cause this until I interviewed him in jail and figured, yes, I mean, this guy would not have done this. And there was loads of other details which made the case that he would not have done this had he not been on this drug. But even though the defense team had a report from me saying all this, they didn't use it. Because for a defense team, the only thing for them is to make sure he didn't get executed. And I imagine they did a deal with the prosecution that all the jurors will say he's guilty, and one of them will say, but I don't think he should be executed. And that's what happened. So he goes down for 3,000 years or whatever, maybe more. But he didn't want to go to jail for 3,000 years. He'd have preferred to be executed. Now, the deal may have happened partly because Pfizer wouldn't have wanted some of the stuff you're about to see now to come into the frame. In 1983, 10 years before Zoloft comes to the market, Pfizer run a healthy volunteer trial, and the healthy volunteers keep diaries. And as you see from this one here, she's talking about felt aggressive in relationships and whilst driving the car. Now, in the trial, the healthy volunteers got 200 milligrams of Zoloft, the ones on Zoloft, and there was a control group. The control group had no problems whatsoever. Everybody, all of the women, they were all women at the Zoloft group, dropped out after 4 days. Pfizer looked at all this and wrote a report on it and said, look, it's very clear that our drug caused this. Serotonin reuptake inhibiting drugs are well known to cause problems like this. While the severity of these cases is disturbing, maybe it's just that these particular women were susceptible. But what you've got here, 10 years before people figure FDA wouldn't let a drug that causes homicide on at the market, you've got Pfizer saying, well, things like this are well known and happen on our drug. How often does this happen? That was a healthy volunteer trial. How often does this happen in clinical trials? Well, here's a little snippet from one of the clinical trials that brought one of the SSRIs on the market. And you've got the doctor down below saying, when we rated this man using the Hamilton rating scale, he was getting better. So this guy would have featured as a cure on this SSRI. But the doctor interviews him more closely and says, finds out the patient saying to him, look, I've been thinking about killing myself and other people. And when you looked a bit more closely, he said, yeah, he does look a bit more agitated. And this just didn't come through on the rating scale. How often does this happen in SSRI trials? Well, 1 in 20 people in an SSRI clinical trial has dropped out for reasons like this. You've seen in the healthy volunteer trial with Zoloft that we did, well, I didn't tell you actually that 1 in 10 of the healthy volunteers who were doing, the other 9 were doing great. 1 in 10 became agitated and aggressive and homicidal and suicidal. 2 in 20, 1 in 10. And you've just seen in the Pfizer healthy volunteer trial that every single volunteer became agitated and heading towards being suicidal or aggressive. So this leads me to the final points that I'm going to make, which is the lady on the left is called Marilyn Lamack, and they're her 3 children, Emily, Nicholas, and Thomas. Marilyn is viewed by everybody who knows her as a superwoman. She's the chief nurse in a busy Chicago hospital ward and runs it wonderfully well, and everybody thinks the world of her. She's got a load of projects in the neighborhood in which she lives, where she's helping out friends and other people and things like that. She's got an overbusy husband who works more than he should and isn't there to help out with the kids. And she's got 3 kids and brings them up wonderfully well. She's got no mental health problems of any sort, except briefly after Emily's birth, where she'd put on a bit of weight, and she was told you should try Prozac, which at the time had a reputation for weight loss. Didn't suit her at all. She did a lot better when she took a stimulant, which did cause weight loss. So, 1998, she's thinking that her husband is thinking of divorcing her. She goes along to a doctor, Dr. Hubbard, and they agree that Zoloft's not the answer to that. A few weeks later, she comes back to him and she's more anxious about the problem. And he says, well, Zoloft can't do any harm. He sees her again every few weeks and he puts the dose up every single time and adds Ativan in. She gets problems from the Ativan. She's got toxicity from the SSRI. It's causing things that only SSRIs can cause. She's getting more anxious and she gets up to a 200 milligram dose. And he asks her how she is, and she says, well, I don't care as much about the divorce now as I did. At this stage, her husband is living openly with another woman. And Dr. Hubbard figures this shows the Zolofts working. A few days later, she calls the emergency room and says, look, I've tried to kill myself and I have killed my 3 children. You had better get over here. And she has. She ends up going to hospital first of all and then on remand in jail where she's tanked full of drugs. Experts come along to assess what on earth went on here. And you have a woman who really can't talk to them because she's so full of drugs. And these guys have no expertise in terms of the drugs causing the kind of problem that she might have had. They don't even think to ask, well, did Zoloft kill your libido, and could that have made things even more awkward with your husband than they'd been beforehand? So the job for the prosecution is easy. At the time in Illinois, there's no law which says you can blame the drug. That has come in since, but at the time, the only options were mental illness. So, yeah, at the prosecution asked all of our friends, did she seem mentally ill to you? And everybody says, no, she didn't. The only person who says anything different was her father, who said, well, for the last few months, she was not the Marilyn that we knew. Dr. Hubbard turns up and says, I think the drug was working fine. She was caring less about the divorce. But no one asks what this might have meant. So Marilyn came off the drugs a few years later in jail and was fine without them. It took about 10 years for her to start thinking maybe the Zoloft played a part in all this, but she's still in jail over 25 years later. I'm not going to ask you, do you think she was guilty or not? I'm not going to ask you, did she get a fair trial? She didn't. The law has changed. With a change in the law, could she now get a fair trial? Well, I'm not going to ask you that. And I'm not even going to ask you, could you get a fair trial? Because I don't think you could. When I say you, I mean probably your children, because it's our kids being put on these drugs these days and are the ones who are going to go on to some kind of homicidal act. Could they get a fair trial? And I don't think they could, because it's going to be, like Bryn said, FDA are not going to believe, juries are not going to believe that FDA would let a drug that can cause a problem like this on the market. Juries are not going to believe that the New England Bible of Medicine is full of junk, that it's fake news and it's completely all wrong. Juries are not going to believe that the distinguished professors of psychiatry from Harvard and Yale and Paris and Berlin or whatever, who turn out to be the experts in court, can be all wrong. That's just not on the radar. Juries are not going to believe that the nice doctor my son or my daughter had, could have been told by his lawyer that if you don't blame the person, if you blame the drug, and the jury buys that, you may be opening yourself up to a charge of involuntary homicide. And most doctors, like Dr. Hubbard and every other doctor that you meet, will say, oh, I'd better not blame the drug. I'll say, yes, I mean, the drug appeared to be working well, so I don't know what happened here. So in a situation like this, I don't know that any of us can get a fair trial, but it's not just a fair trial. If the factors leading to us not being able to get a fair trial are leading to us not being able to get good clinical care either, and things are getting worse, not better. That's why at the start I asked you for your input to this thing that I don't have any real answers for. I did say it's hard to get experts. I know of almost no other experts who get involved in cases like this. And I'm an old man and I'm not going to be around much longer. Can you believe the things that I'm telling you? Well, for 25 years, every time I give a talk like this or anywhere else or any articles I write or even emails I send, I assume that pharmaceutical companies read everything and listen to everything. And as this note here tells you, they'll have people in the audience, perhaps even in this audience, keeping an eye on every single thing I say with a view to suing me. So I think you can believe the things I'm saying, partly because I haven't ever been sued. Hopefully that's not um, bringing the fates down on top of me. Thank you very much for listening.
David, that was a great talk. Unbelievably scary and frightening and horrific in a way.
Do you want me to halt the share of the screen?
Yeah, please halt the share of the screen, and we're going to go to Christopher just a second. So everybody, we're going to give Christopher a time to present a few slides, talk about the issues that David raised here, and then Jim will do as well. We were supposedly going to end at 3. We can go as long as we need. And this, I think, is such a profound issue. I want to give time for Chris to speak, make his thoughts known, and then Jim. I had one thought, David, when you were speaking, that the drug induces what in the previous religious time we might call a satanic possession.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, there is a real good and evil theme to all this. So yes, that's fine. Yeah.
And in that sense, we see it as an outside possession of the person's being, soul, whatever.
Yes.
But really, there is a lot of way to liken possession or what was seen to what happens under these drugs. Completely frightening, I have to say.
Yep.
And scary, and so needed to be known and talked about. And I think, our audience today, the people here, you've given them a lot to think about and a lot to respond to. So, Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you. Then after you, we'll go to Jim and we'll have a little discussion. I just want to say to everyone here, stay tuned. We'll stay as long as we need to get these issues talked about and give everyone a chance. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Bob, thank you very much. And David also. Greetings, everyone. The cases David discusses in his paper are extremely troubling and heartbreaking in that they involve otherwise well-functioning adults with few, if any, indications of distress, taking an SSRI on the advice of doctors. But the physicians in questions are, as we've just heard, heavily reliant on an evidence base bearing unmistakable signs of fraud, that is, of adverse effects such as suicide ideation being assigned to the placebo arm of clinical trials, of disappearing completely from published reports, some of which are also ghostwritten. So I want to connect just a few more dots in David's otherwise hugely comprehensive paper, including via the few studies that we do have on SSRIs and violent behavior and the history of the added black box warning. While prescribing rates of SSRIs reaching almost 1 in 6 in the UK and 1 in 10 in the US, we should be having national conversations, as David advises, about drug-induced intoxication, dysregulation, and violence. So first enter these studies, and I'm just going to hit a right arrow. Does that work? The best years so far for establishing evidence of a strong and clear association between SSRIs and unpremeditated violence turned out to be 2015 and 2016, close to 3 decades after Prozac first received FDA approval in '87, and over a decade after the agency added a black box warning to all SSRIs. So a 2016 review of over 70 trials found an increase in events of aggression with antidepressants, with a doubling of both suicidality and aggression in children and adolescents. A consistent theme of the paper, though, is that adverse effects are heavily underreported in many of the trials cited, with insufficient and non-systematic accounting. Later that same year, 2016, a systematic review of almost 6,000 publications and 130 trials published in the UK's prestigious Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine identified an increase in healthy adult volunteers as well as in children, and not by a small margin. They included in their general rubric for violence, antisocial behavior, assaultive behavior, criminal behavior, homicidal ideation, homicide, physical abuse, physical assault, physically threatening behavior, and violence-related symptoms. And antidepressants, they concluded, doubled their risk of harms related to suicidality and violence, with an odds ratio of 1.85. With access to the data for only 11 of 13 key trials, they added, quote, there can be little doubt that we underestimate the harms of antidepressants. Both of these built on a cohort study published the year before in PLOS Medicine, in which a team of researchers in Sweden determined from a national registry involving roughly 850,000 individuals, that is a whopping 10.8% of the national population, that there was, quote, a significant association between SSRIs and violent crime convictions for males and for females aged 15 to 24. Namely a 43% increase in their risk of committing violent crime while on an SSRI. My interest then here is several-fold. First, the association has been studied, and the evidence of all three studies is unambiguously negative for SSRIs that have been marketed, as David reminds us, as mild and largely without adverse effects. Second, though it was quickly minimized and memory hold, as we say in the States, the Swedish cohort study was quite well reported at the time. I've been quoting in part from a detailed news article in Reuters. Third, as you might expect from all the obvious quarters, the few caveats that do exist in the Swedish study, namely concern about residual confounding from alcohol and other substances taken on top of an SSRI, were parsed to death until the substantial finding of a 43% increase in the risk of committing violent crime disappeared for some into greater concern about unmet need and the plight of the not yet diagnosed. This, by my reckoning, is bad faith, confounding, poor reporting, and selectively invoked blind spots over SSRIs and violence, including that some have a vested interest in obscuring the associations that are found. It's worth remembering, too, that while the fight to get the FDA to add the black box warnings, it's both serious, to SSRIs was real, a serious slog to those of us who remember, the agency actually expanded the warning in 2006 from 9 SSRIs to include all 36 antidepressants then available, while also raising the age of those affected from 18 to 24. But the agency stopped short of investigating violence beyond suicide and suicidal behavior, effectively leaving all other manifestations of drug-induced violence unexamined. Throughout the same years, the warning itself, of course, was consistently second-guessed as going too far, as causing harms, as fear-mongering, and as discouraging treatment. Meanwhile, as David indicates toward the end of his paper, some states in the US and Australia and some provinces in Canada, as well as European countries and the UK, do allow for the defense of involuntary intoxication by prescribed medication. The US Supreme Court, in fact, even ruled on this in 1915 in Perkins v. United States, providing the accused took physician-prescribed medication as directed in good faith and was left in a state of insanity, in that case from chloral hydrate, which had been prescribed for nervousness. It's, of course, not at all clear that today's court would even agree to hear the case, much less reverse conviction for manslaughter, as they did right in the First World War. On top of which, the problem of establishing clear and unambiguous causality of violence by taking an SSRI means, as David's pointed out, that the burden of establishing proof beyond a reasonable doubt falls entirely on the defense. And as David notes, most juries will buckle under that standard of proof because it means challenging agencies such as the FDA, which have never studied the topic directly, and researchers who have reviewed dozens of flawed, incompletely documented clinical trials that are widely known to underreport adverse events or pass them off outrageously as a problem of placebo. In short, we do have, in many places, in many countries, a legal defense of involuntary intoxication, but its history is spotty. It requires a rule-out of all possible confounders, such as alcohol, and to establish correlation as the highest level of proof. And in this respect, the legal defense requires a level of certainty that clinical trials themselves generally can't provide. When it comes to antidepressants and murders, that is, we're dealing very much with a situation of case not closed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Listening to you and David, just hearing from the first two of you, and then we're going to go to Jim here, is the evidence here is overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's not really, you can't you can't dispute that this can happen with some frequency. And,
Mhm.
and, you know, I was looking at your last slide with those 3 kids, and I know people who've killed their kids have had, it's the tragedy is so overwhelming. And even, you know, they never really get over the fact that how could I have done this?
Mhm.
You know, years later, they see that it was drug induced, but still they say to themselves, how could I have possibly done this? And anyway, this has been such an important thing. Jim, we're going to go to you now.
Okay, thanks everybody. So I don't know that I really belong in this August panel, but I'm not really a criminal defense lawyer, and my views here are maybe a little bit simplistic, but I think I hope I have something to offer here. I mean, one thing is like I think it would be good to use different language, and this is hard to do in legal cases. But I mean, automatism, that doesn't sound very sympathetic. Involuntary insanity, iatrogen, involuntary intoxication, I mean, is not very sympathetic. And I've been trying to promote the term iatrogenic insanity as really an accurate description of what happens, which is that someone has become crazy because of the drugs. I mean, I hope I don't offend anybody by saying crazy, but I like that word. Because of this drug that a doctor has prescribed. And that really, I think, eliminates the whole criminal intent. And it's and who's really responsible? And it's the prescriber. And I think that both David and Chris, when they say that the juries won't really go along with that, I think that's really pretty true. When you have this concept in medicine, well, you have risks versus benefits, or harms versus benefits, and you weigh those. But I do think really that this idea of iatrogenic insanity, which, where it's caused by the treatment, is a much more sympathetic term to use. So, I mean, how do we, is it possible to really get there? I don't know. I think fundamentally, judges and lawyers, juries reflect society's understanding of things, and we really need to, in order to have any effect, is to really change that understanding. I've been trying to do that for almost 20 years and haven't come up with it, but I think that's the fundamentally what needs to change. And then my final comment, which I think David hit on a little bit, is that any lawyer recommending the insanity defense for anything other than a capital offense, meaning someone is facing the death penalty, in my view, is committing malpractice. And the reason for that, it used to be when people got not guilty by reason of insanity verdict, and David talked about this, is they were just not guilty and let free. But now they're locked up in psych hospitals and basically drugged into oblivion. And in most of the time, and that's kind of indefinite. And so most of the time, people would be better off getting a guilty verdict and serving their time, in my view, than being found not guilty by reason of insanity and turned over to the psychiatric system. So I don't know that I had anything profound to say, but these are my thoughts.
Jim, actually, I think that's very important because this is what happens to people, even if they get let off in some ways, declared innocent because of not guilty, not innocent, not guilty by reason of insanity. They do go to psych hospitals and they're medicated like crazy, and it's non-ending. They don't have any time to ending time. All of which just deepens the sense of tragedy, what we're talking about here, and the sense of harm sometimes is absolutely overwhelming to the kids, to anybody who were killed by the Aurora shooters. And I have to, I come at this from a journalistic background, and one of the things that really bothers me is such a failure is really the failure of the mainstream media to explore this, to make this evidence known. And the Lindsay Clancy case was such an example of this journalistic failure. Lindsay Clancy was a nurse. I forget which Harvard hospital she was. I think she was an OBGYN nurse. And what happens with her, I think was her third child. We have parental leave in Massachusetts. So she had some time off, but now she was starting to be depressed about going back to work, having just given birth in some period of time. And she goes to a psychiatrist, and next thing you know, she's on all sorts of drugs, including an SSRI. Now, there's no way to see what she then does, kills her 3 kids and jumps out and breaks her back, without seeing that the drugs are a causal agent here. There's just nothing in her past. She was seen as empathic, a good nurse, a good mother. Nothing foretells this behavior. Now, initially, the attorney sort of brings this up, that she was medicated out the kazoo. But you know what then happens in the press, including in the Boston Globe? It's like, oh no, this is the disease. This is postpartum depression that caused this. It wasn't the drugs. And next thing you know, that disappears from the public consciousness that she was medicated up. And all I'm going to say is I do not understand the lack of, I sort of understand, but the fact that mainstream media hasn't gone after this story, because the evidence is there. It's there in personal cases. Chris, you reviewed sort of big picture data that shows that it comes out. Thomas More and Joseph Glenmullen did a thing where they looked at reports of adverse violent events reported to the FDA. It's there. The SSRIs are all over that database. And yet we can't bring this to public consciousness in the way what is needed. So first of all, thank you all for being here today. And then we're going to open this up. It's such a needed conversation. I have to say, the other thought I had, David, when you were talking, and then with Chris and all, we believe in informed consent. I really wonder how many people would take SSRIs if they were warned of the possibility that they may get thoughts that are ordering them to kill themselves or kill others with some frequency. I really wonder, would we have these frequently taken?
Or lose their sex life.
Even that. Yes, there's so much to the informed consent. But David, you were sounding something like what, 5% start feeling with the healthy volunteers have these with the healthy volunteers?
Yes, sure.
Like 5%.
That's 1 in 10. 1 in 10, 10%.
10%. That's a common adverse effect.
Sure. Yeah.
So anyway, why don't we open this up for questions?
Can I just say one thing, which is, say that the media has failed to bring this out, and I wish this weren't so, but I think it's really hard not to believe that the massive amount of pharmaceutical advertising is affecting that. I mean, I certainly believe that the drug companies would be all over these media companies if they started bringing this stuff out.
Sure. There's an old phrase that came from F. Scott Fitzgerald, which was the sign of a sophisticated mind is to be able to keep 2 contradictory thoughts in your mind at the same time and still function. Doctors could do that once upon a time, and mothers could do it, but increasingly we can't when it comes to drugs. They either work wonderfully well and everybody gets them, or we want to get rid of them completely. Whereas, what might suit you, Jim, may be totally wrong for me. And as Arvid Carlson brings out, who gets a Nobel Prize for creating the SSRIs, nicotine may be better for either of us than whatever else we're on.
And just go ahead, Chris.
Just to corroborate what you're saying, Bob, after a mass shooting at Northern Illinois University in 2008, which was just an hour from my campus then, the Chicago Tribune did run a piece. They called it Prozac, violence rarely linked, which was completely at odds with the evidence. And then they spent the entire article quoting biological psychiatrists who disowned the association completely and denied that there was anything that could be in the drug itself that would be inducing that kind of violence. Even though, as you're saying, there's this database, including of people committing mass killings that are where they're on a cocktail of drugs, as this guy was. My own university responded by just asking, by putting up a sticker of revolver on every single door entering the building so that you had a reminder of the risk, but there was absolutely nothing more. So that was, they did pick up the story, they reported it, but in such a way as to deny any kind of plausible association even between the drug and the violence.
So, the media now is serving the interests, the commercial interests and guild interests. And I know we like to blame the pharmaceutical companies. I personally put the blame on the guild and the medical profession. And the reason I do is the pharmaceutical companies are not really seen as having a moral obligation, ethical obligation to the public. They're money-making chemical companies. But doctors do have a moral obligation and an ethical obligation. So I blame the doctors. And then they come out and trot them out to just what you're saying, Chris, to sort of say, oh, no, it's really not a problem. They become the excuse. They dismiss the cases. So from my point of view, we should be talking about a guild that's not making this known, a medical profession, and then discounts it. And they know about this data, too. They actually do know about the data. And they, in my opinion, they're betraying the public when they don't make it known and they don't talk about it. So I got some questions here, or comments here. The first one really is a question about resources. And David, you can talk about this as well. And what is the best database linking these dangerous meds with homicidal and suicidal acts? I will say that after hearing this, I think that Mad in America will try to put up a database with source citations. But what do you think that's already out there?
There isn't a great deal of stuff. Chris has listed most of the articles that are worthwhile. I wrote a PLOS Medicine article in 2006, which went through a few of the cases that you've just heard and produced some of the data as well. But it's not just a data issue. Part of the problem is doctors are going by the evidence, by the data, the published data, et cetera, et cetera. And while there is some published data out there, sure, which points to an issue, the problem still is you'll get a bunch of doctors who will know about the published data, as you've mentioned, who, when faced with a patient in front of them becoming homicidal on the drug, will say, this is your illness getting worse, I need to increase the dose. They don't know how to assess patients anymore. They've become people of the book, and I don't know that we want to say to them, look, there is data out here, there are articles, there are books, and you should read those, because there's lots of other books that will say just the opposite. That what's lost is the clinical skill to be able to evaluate the person in front of you. And to say the obvious thing, which is, this guy was fine a few days ago and he's not now,
So, David, in the absence of that clinical expertise or knowledge being practiced, I think we also need a societal discussion that forces it into the conversation, even between patient and doctor. And I just want to, this is so we need a societal discussion so it does become that interaction between doctor and patient.
And one of the, I don't know, maybe get rid of it. Let me put it like this. This is going to sound heretical. I didn't plan to say anything like this. We will be a lot safer with these drugs available over the counter. People can get SSRI antihistamines over the counter. If they don't suit them, they stop them. There isn't a doctor in the way saying, oh no, you mustn't stop them. You must increase the dose. You must keep taking them for weeks before they work. So maybe doctors need to face a serious challenge, which is given that they're not doing their job, they're about to go out of business. Maybe we need to decide we would be safer if we didn't have them in the way.
Well, and also raising issues of safety and defense in order defense of their products, right? Because they have a vested interest in defending the products when they're on prescription.
Sure. And what will happen is you go on an SSRI over the counter, you go home, and your wife or your kids, everybody who knows you says, oh, you've had a change of personality. That's not happening now because they figure the doctor knows what's going on, when the family know much more about what's going on than the doctor does.
I want to give a shout out to the many people in the audience, because the other thing that has helped make this known is, in fact, patient accounts, individual case reports,
Absolutely.
which get eliminated from when we review the evidence. But once upon a time, and you guys can say whether or not this is true, case reports were seen as very important evidence for being a good doctor, right?
Absolutely.
Listening to your patient, seeing what's happening on an individual level as well. So those of you in the audience, just so you know, your stories are so important.
They are the most important.
One of the things most important thing. So one of the things that we hope to come out of here is more personal accounts going to RX Risk, to EMAT in America, and we'll try to compile these into making it known. I have a couple questions here. Can seemingly premeditated before committing a homicide rule out the use of voluntary intoxication defense? So if I've been thinking about do it right away, then I finally do it, does that, the fact that it's premeditated, rule out defense? And I guess the question is, did you have these? Anybody want to take that one on?
I think it's clear that you can have these thoughts and for the most part can control them, but all it can take is a bit of absent-minded, or you take a drink or something like that, and the balance gets disturbed. So I think simply being able to say the person had these thoughts beforehand or even drew up a plan doesn't mean that the drug isn't responsible for what happened.
So here's a question that is almost seen as you can't ask it in polite society. To what extent, and this is to all of you three, to what extent do you think that SSRIs have contributed to mass shootings in the United States? Did you all hear that?
Well, every time, I hear it. I mean, every time that, we hear of one of these really kind of inexplicable shootings, I suspect, and so I think it's a pretty high percentage. And what seems to be happening is that the authorities are suppressing the prescription history. I mean, the one that comes to mind the most to me is Adam Lanza. I think he was the one in Sandy Hook, where it started to come up, and then the officials actually, I mean, there was some document that said we cannot, let this be known because, people then start. I think it was the reason was people will stop, taking the drugs, which of course would be the best thing. So I think it's a pretty high percentage of these inexplicable mass shootings.
Chris?
I would agree with Jim. It's a high percentage. It's not an exclusive percentage. There are records of mass shootings with people on different forms of drugs, different tranquilizers or benzos or antipsychotics, and so we can't. That's why I think the ruling about prescription meds is critical, because it opens it up to factors beyond SSRIs. So we have to be careful not to limit this just to them, that there are obviously SNRIs as part of this discussion, but also in the documented cases that I reviewed, there are some that occur without an SSRI, although the vast number do, and that is disturbing. It's also timed, of course, with Congress deciding not to renew the assault weapons ban for political reasons after Bill Clinton had insisted upon it, and where there had been a massive drop-off in shootings. So there is obviously a responsibility for the military-grade weapons that are available, because they enable so many more deaths. At the same time, we can't limit it to just simply SSRIs, but it is an alarming number.
David, any thoughts?
Just on my point. The other thing to say is just that the point that comes up over and again, and Jim was alluding to this, is that if you detail the factors of the drugs, you are then stigmatizing use of the drug, and you're stigmatizing the mentally ill. Whereas, in a sense, what that's doing is showing how overdetermined is the relationship between treatment of depression, treatment of anxiety, and SSRIs, because if you take them away, there are obviously other forms of treatment available. But in the press, in the minds of the press, that is itself highly stigmatizing, which is kind of fascinating, because it's an indicator of how far we've come in that argument around association.
David, you've been asked to be a defense witness sometime. What do you think on this question?
Yeah. One of the things after a few of these cases I chased that may interest you was I chased the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Association or Union.
Yeah.
And I thought they'd be interested in the fact, look, I know there's people in prison who are in there because they've killed people or been criminals, and it's been caused by the pills. Can I work with you? And we can sort of begin to have a look at some of these kind of situations. And the answer from ACLU was very interesting, which was, no, we can't. We don't want to deter prisoners from getting the pills they might want or need. Okay. So that, I think, actually says a lot.
When Obama was president, there was one of these mass shootings, and when Obama was president, you were allowed to put up a petition, and so on the White House thing, and if they got 25,000 signatures, they would respond to it. So we got involved with promoting. Someone else had put the petition on, promoting the petition, and the signatures started coming in like crazy. Next thing you know, that petition was pulled down. In other words, this was not going to be a type of inquiry. Now, here's the point is, there's this thought that they're involved often, not always, but it would be nice to know the frequency. It's just part of the medical history that is leading up to these horrific events and, school shootings and stuff. So if we really cared about our children, maybe we could just at least have this inquiry into each time, is there a possible causal factor? But we can't even have that discussion. What you're hearing from you, David, and Jim and Chris, is we don't really have this societal discussion, and that's what I find so dispiriting. Okay, sure. I've got one last question for you, and all of you can jump in on this one. And this is particularly based on your research and expertise, talking to the panel, are you aware of any circumstances in which the potential benefits of an SSRI exceed the risks? I ask because it is difficult for me to come up with such a situation where benefits exceeds the risk of these pills. So that's a question to any of the panel that wants to do it, and then we'll close this up.
Just quickly, the issue comes back to individual cases. FDA say they license things on a benefit risk basis. This is crap. If an SSRI suits me, Bob, and nicotine suits you, you're the one who's best placed to decide the SSRI didn't suit you and nicotine did. I might decide, well, it did suit me. I like the effect. It worked fine for me. And I'll make sure that I'm on too high a dose. So you've got to leave it to individual people. But it is the case when we get to the stage that 15 to 20% of the population of most Western countries is on these drugs, that is a crazy state. We'd be a lot safer if most people were taking nicotine again. But
All right. Last thoughts before we close this up. We'll go around the horn. Jim, last thoughts?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's I really thank you, Bob, and Matt and Micah for bringing us on, and David and Chris for doing it. I think it's been good.
Okay, great. Chris, last thoughts.
I'm also extremely grateful to David and Jim and Bob for hosting this for Mad in America. For me, it might be time to renew pressure on the FDA in terms of insisting that the data be studied and be more widely available. But I would say, I mean, I know there's a sort of sense of hopelessness around this, but there are, even in the expansion of these legal cases, even though they're so difficult to prove, the fact that they exist is something. I mean, David mentioned Illinois, the fact that my home state does now provide that as a legal form of defense is a big deal, especially if that's, those are the charges that you're facing. So I think there's pressure to bring. I think that obviously the media has to do a much, much better job. But the assault weapons ban, I mean, so much of this is contingent on electoral results. So if we have a landslide in November, we may still, if there's a supermajority of the filibuster can be removed, then you get the assault weapons ban. That's really something. It's not going to end this problem with SSRIs, but there are practical steps that can be taken still.
David, thank you, Chris.
Bob, thanks very much for hosting all this. And there's some interesting places that we can look. You and I are both due to talk to veterans in a week's time. And there are ginger groups like that who, if they pick up the issue, they're being mistreated the way everyone else is, and they're ending up in jail, and the drugs cause it. There's groups like that, and Derek Bumka, who's the key person behind it, they potentially have the power to make a difference in a way that very few of the rest of us do, because the politicians listen to, perhaps because they're slightly scared of vets, so maybe it's a thing that we need to look at and build on.
Yeah, this is what David is talking about, the Derek Blumke, who is a veteran. He actually ran our veterans page for a time, but he's a really activist person, and he's bringing up at a national level and also at a state level increased suicides and cases of violence. They do isolate individual stories, and so he's got this on the agenda, that he's really bringing it on the agenda of the whole Veterans Administration, but also local associations of the veterans for foreign wars, where they have their meeting groups, et cetera. So it's an example of one person really marshaling an effort to get a larger group focused on this. And there is this sense we're supposed to do right by our veterans. They are seen as a special group in the United States. And so if the VA starts saying this is a problem, the way we're medicating our veterans, that can really make a difference. So I agree with this. I just want to say, first of all, thank you, David. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jim. I also want to give thanks to James Moore, who moderated the chat, to Zoe Gunif, who organized this for Mad in America. It's something I think Mad in America is very proud that we can be a forum for at least airing these discussions. And I want to say to everybody in the chat room and all, the message here was how important you are to this discussion. Please tell your stories to Mad in America, to David, whatever you can to help publicize this story. Jim, of course, is involved with Mind Freedom. It's another great organization to make these stories of harm known. And finally, so thank you all for coming. Just a reminder that Mad in America is a nonprofit organization. We rely on your donations. And thank you for those of you donated to be here. And if you can subscribe to Mad in America, that's great too. So thank you all. A great 2 hours. Thanks for being here.